Hi everyone, this is Mr. Trio, and today we will focus on the fourth focus point for the chapter, Were the Peace Treaties of 1919 to 23 fair? This is the last focus point in the area, and this focus point is a little bit more theory than the others, and it really builds upon the previous three focus points. So, as a reminder, if you haven't watched the other videos, please go and take a look at those first and then come back to this at the end, because it really is a process in which we're building a foundation of information about this topic, and here is where we actually start to apply some of the concepts and think about different points of view. Now, one of the things that I would like to do is have a short introduction through the form of a timeline. We use timelines all the time. But essentially, this is a timeline which has a different purpose. And the purpose of this timeline is that I would like you to try to put yourself in the shoes of the people of the time. So if we start with our timeline, and we have the First World War that takes place between 1914 and 1919, and then shortly afterwards, we have the Peace Treaty settlements, which set the conditions for Germany and its allies, what they will have to do at the end of the war. And then we have the Second World War that begins in 1939. Now, as you can see from our timeline, there's only a 20-year difference between the Peace Treaty and the break of the Second World War. The Second World War, in many people's opinion, is the worst catastrophe in human history. More lives will be lost during this time period than any other period of time. So the question that you might ask yourself as a student of history is, what happens in this period between the two wars? And essentially, how is this Peace Treaty of 1919 a part of this story? And this is really the genesis, if you will, of our focus point. Could the treaties be justified at the time? I think that there is no question whether or not the treaties were good. Obviously, as a student of history, we can look back and say that they only lasted for 20 years. But more to the point is, as a student of history, can we look at the treaty at the time and take a look at it and say, were they justified? Now, there were many people who would say that at the time, the treaties were too harsh. Some might say that they were justified. Of course, who would have said that they were too harsh? Most Germans, of course. And who said that they were mostly justified? Most French. So here we have our two extremes. Now, when we look at the too harsh angle from this, people at the time said things such as, it is a peace of revenge. Or in other words, people were fully aware that the conditions, in part, were motivated by the fact that France felt that it was damaged during the war, that it had been attacked. They had a long history, of course, dating back many centuries, of course, and that there were political cartoons at the time, such as this one called The Finishing Touch, in which the Allies are pushing the Germans into the water. In other words, this peace treaty is very much a way to seek revenge for the actions of the First World War. Those who view this as justified might say, essentially, we have to do this because it is not a peace treaty, it is armistice for 20 years. And even at the time, as is illustrated in this political cartoon, the people who are assembling at Versailles in 1919 are fully aware that the next generation will be pulled into another war, because the conditions that are apparent in Europe at this time are not being fixed by this treaty, and that the treaty could actually be more harsh. So here are the two extremes, the too harsh and then the justified group. Many people, like President Woodrow Wilson, would say that it was a very harsh treaty, but he also said that it was justified in that the Germans deserved it. So maybe Wilson is somewhere in that middle area. Now, as we look at this question, could the treaties be justified at the time? One of the things that I would recommend to you is to try to think about point of view. There are essentially 2 points of view in which you can take. One, which is looking forward, and that's illustrated through this telescope, looking into the distance from 1919 forward. Or, as a student of history, we can be looking backwards with the full knowledge of what is happening in the years afterwards and how the two are related. As we begin to make arguments about are the treaties justified or not, essentially these are the 2 approaches that we can take. Trying to put ourselves in the shoes of the people in 1919 and saying, are these justified at the time? Or are we going to try to look back and revise history based on the knowledge that we currently have? So here's our 2 points of view. What would someone looking forward focus on? One of the things that you could easily say in 1919 is that Germany was clearly the aggressor in the war, that France was severely damaged by the war and needed compensation. You could also point out that there was a long history of disputes between France and Germany, and that the treaty essentially was trying to correct some of these disputes. It was also standard practice at the time to make reparations on your enemy, take territory. And then, last but not least, when Russia surrendered to Germany in 1918, these terms of surrender were very similar to what Germany had imposed on Russia. So the time period, you could say, is Germany was getting a little bit of its own medicine. Now, on the other side of the coin, looking backwards, what are the types of arguments that we could make for justifying this treaty? Well, you could say that these conditions of the treaty helped to bring extremists to power, and certainly the Nazi Party in Germany is a direct result of the Treaty of Versailles. You could also say that the treaty made it more difficult for Germany to recover. If Germany had been able to recover quicker, perhaps it would have been a better neighbor in Europe in the 1930s instead of an aggressor. You could also say that the treaty is directly related to Germans wanting to seek revenge in the 30s because of the way that they are treated. And then last, this treaty in many ways created an atmosphere in which when the Nazi Party and Hitler start acting badly in the 1930s, people understand why he is acting that way. And we will talk about this concept a little later in other chapters, but mainly people in Great Britain appease Hitler because they think back to this treaty and in some ways feel that it was too harsh at the time. Thus, this treaty helped to set the foundation for justifying Hitler's aggressions in the 1930s. So, this is a relatively short focus point. It's mainly theoretical because we are thinking about which side of the coin we would want to make as an argument. We'll be working on this more in class, building arguments. Of course, we will also be looking further at some of the primary source and secondary source information that will help to back up the point of view in which you take. Thanks for joining me today, and as a reminder, this presentation is located on our Google Classroom site where you can take more time to look at it closer and even download it. Talk to you later.